In this video, I describe the variation in the political paths taken by the states of the former Soviet Union. We'll discuss the reasons for this variation in class. This video simply demonstrates some of the shared characteristics among these cases. The first thing to note is that we do see a range of political regimes in the former Soviet space. There are a few consolidated democracies, specifically the Baltic states, which have been integrated into European institutions. But most Eurasian countries are either consolidated dictatorships, in purple, or hybrid states, in yellow, and this is according to Freedom House scores for 2019. The distinctions between these cases appeared fairly early on. Countries where a national opposition leader won the first post-communist election, or where there was an early transfer of power between two different factions, have, on average, higher democracy scores today than those countries where former communists retained power in the first two elections. Georgia and Kyrgyzstan are notable exceptions here. Here the democracy score I'm using is the Varieties of Democracy Electoral Democracy Index for 2020. Aside from the Baltics, countries where non-communists won the first or second election have not, however, had straightforward paths to democracy. Instead, they have experienced varying degrees of illiberal politics, punctuated by protest movements that have pushed for political change. The most significant of these protest movements were the color revolutions of the mid-2000s. Named for the colors, or flowers, protesters chose to represent their movements. These revolutions were coordinated and successful opposition efforts to overturn the results of unfair elections. They benefited from diffusion or demonstration effects, where opposition see the success of certain tactics in neighboring countries and adapt them to local use. They're also a part of the overall trend of democratization by election, where oppositions are actually able to come to power through unfair elections in competitive authoritarian regimes. These revolutions did not, however, lead to lasting change. Georgia, Ukraine, and Kyrgyzstan have all experienced repeat revolutions, additional mass protests designed to oust backsliding leaders from power. These protests are more idiosyncratic in their origins and outcomes. In Georgia, the protests were designed to pressure an increasingly authoritarian president after Georgia's poor performance in their 2008 war with Russia. Armenia, which experienced a violent revolution in 2019, may be headed down a similar path due to public dissatisfaction over the situation in Nagorno-Karabakh. In Ukraine, the Euromaidan protests opposed the government's rejection of a cooperation agreement with the EU in favor of economic cooperation with Russia, and they successfully ousted the president. By contrast, in Kyrgyzstan, elite mobilization of mobs has become a part of the expression of political power. In October 2020, protesters for the third time forced the resignation of the president after questionable elections on October 4th. They placed in power an opposition figure who had been imprisoned for kidnapping a rival politician. In some cases, these secondary revolutions and protests indicate the presence of a strong, but specific, type of civil society. This represents the ability to mobilize protesters, but not organized groups that can either pressure or monitor the government. In all cases, though, they demonstrate the weakness of political institutions, changes happening on the streets, not through the ballot box or through legislation. To turn to the consolidated authoritarian cases briefly, the main trend we see here is leadership stability. Some countries have leaders who have won repeated elections and modified constitutions and other laws in order to continue to be able to do so. In some cases, authoritarian states have conducted managed transitions between authoritarian leaders. In the case of Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, the death of the country's first leader led to the promotion to power of a long-established successor, the prime minister in Turkmenistan and vice president in Uzbekistan. While Turkmenistan kept to politics as usual after the change, even down to maintaining a cult of personality around the leader, Uzbekistan is taking the opportunity to make some gradual economic reforms. Kazakhstan is a unique case in some ways, in that the first president chose to retire rather than die in office. The former diplomat and chosen successor who became president in 2019 has therefore had to manage keeping the former president out of politics, including by renaming the capital after him, while forging his own path.